First of all, Germany has definitely got a lower level of regional economic inequality than the UK has by a long chalk. And as a result of the various things that Germany has done since reunification, the eastern states, which really were terrifically devastated economically at the end of communism, have gone a long way towards catching up. Now, the question is, how much did this mechanism that Andy Burnham has seized on actually contribute to that difference? And I think you can make the case that it was not the dominant factor. There were other fiscal mechanisms that probably contributed about twice as much alongside it.
Let's talk about our opening story, though, and this concerns the Prime Minister in waiting, Andy Burnham. Here he is setting out his vision for Britain in a speech he gave on Monday.
Now get this. Number 10 North will be the nerve centre of a rewired Britain. It will be the conduit through which we redistribute power and resources across the UK. It will coordinate all parts of government at national and local level to agree a long-term economic strategy and help all places set new growth ambitions. It will be given a mission to strive for equivalent living conditions in all parts of Britain, borrowing from the German Basic Law.
Well, there you go. Andy Burnham's mentioned it there. He alluded to a desire to move to a German-style system which could guarantee equivalent living conditions in the UK. Germany is made up of 16 federal states, and under basic law, known as Grundgesetz, apologies if that's not quite right, in which the state is legally and constitutionally mandated to ensure those so-called equivalent living conditions across the country. So is Burnham right to suggest that the UK is one of the most over-centralised countries in Europe? And could he achieve greater economic growth by implementing a more federalised system of government? Well, Oliver Moody is the Berlin correspondent for The Times and The Sunday Times and might be able to help us with some of those answers. He's written about this in the paper for tomorrow. It's up online right now. Ollie, good evening to you. Welcome along.
Good evening, Kate. That was a great effort at Grundgesetz.
Thank you. Well,
definitely 9 out of 10.
Yeah, I did do GCSE German, and I hope I've not let my German teacher down with that one. There are loads of other German words coming up. I'll just perhaps let you handle those ones. So I've kind of laid out the basics there. 16 federal states under basic law, and they run with their own equivalent sort of laws or parliament, or how do they work?
Well, the first thing to say is that Andy Burnham has very much garbled his account of how the German system operates to the point where I'm not sure he's quite put as much thought into it as he might have done. So the basic law, the Grundgesetz, that is Germany's de facto post-war constitution. And what Andy Burnham appears to have in mind is a particular clause within that constitution that used to guarantee Germans, wherever they are in the country, uniform living standards. And that was updated in the 90s after reunification to equivalent living standards, which was basically an admission that they couldn't get the new post-communist eastern states up to quite the same
they couldn't level up, basically,
as the West.
Yeah,
exactly. And so there are a number of different mechanisms that are used to fulfill this constitutional obligation, or try to. And the one that Burnham seems to have in mind when you read the book that he wrote about this with Steve Rotherham, the Mayor of Liverpool, 2 years ago, is what is known as the Länderfinanzausgleich, the balancing of sort of fiscal balancing between the states. And basically what this is they take VAT revenues away from the richest states and give them to the poorer states. And then the federal government will also top up the poorer states out of the general budget. And that's worth a total of about 20 billion euros a year of transfers, which sounds like a lot in the abstract, but when you think that's about 0.4% of Germany's GDP or 1% of total public spending, it's not trivial, but it's also not a kind of transformational sum.
But I bet the biggest contributors to the VAT take are never completely happy with this idea. As sort of noble as it is, it must be pretty galling for those richer areas to be effectively propping up some of the poorer ones.
Your guess is absolutely on the money, particularly Bavaria, which has to give a kind of gigantically disproportionate share of these transfers, something like 10 billion euros a year. So it's literally doing half of the lifting for the other states on its own. And they have challenged it through Germany's constitutional court, I think at least half a dozen times since the kind of modern West German system was set up in 1949. And you can imagine in the UK as well, given the very disproportionate concentration of prosperity in London and the southeast, that you would have a relatively narrow base of taxpayers subsidising a very large base of net recipients.
Yeah, Burnham makes this argument, actually. He says as well as wanting to boost the North, it is also about the fact that that in London as a taxpayer, some of our taxes go towards supporting the North because the North isn't as buoyant as it should be. So one of Burnham's arguments is, look, I'm going to focus on the North, but actually that means that you as taxpayers down south and in London particularly don't have to keep filling in the gaps. I mean, I suppose for those federal states that pump into the taxes, pump into VAT, they've got the assurance of knowing that if they were ever to fall on hard times, they would be the ones supported. But then it leads me to question those federal states that are the recipients of this money for levelling up, both from the richer federal states and from government take as well. What is there to incentivise them? If they're being sort of bailed out all the time, levelled up all the time, what is there to incentivise them to improve?
It's a very good question, and the answer is that they don't get all of their deficits paid for out of this mechanism. So they have to introduce saving measures anyway. And the sums that they're getting are not transformational. I mean, the largest recipient last year was Berlin, which got, I think, about 3.5 billion euros. Compared to Berlin's kind of overall budget, that's not a drop in the ocean, but it's not a kind of gigantic sum either. It's not really big enough to take the pressure off the city-state authorities to have to make massive spending cuts.
These equivalent living standards, what are the pillars of that? When we say equivalent living standards, what are the issues that are really important to make sure that there's equal provision across states?
Yeah, that's a really good question because it kind of has a double meaning. So the way that it is defined in the mechanisms for distributing the money is financial. It's basically given how many people live in your state and given what the overall tax take is, what proportion of that money would naturally go to your state if it was divided fairly. But also the commission that was set up to kind of monitor this process has set out a bunch of goals, which basically amount to everyone in Germany should have a reasonable expectation of having basically the same standard of public services. And that will be things like provision of free childcare, broadband and mobile connectivity, road and rail infrastructure, but also beyond public services, that money can be spent on generating jobs. So there's an element of economic stimulus as well.
Would this be a good idea for the UK, Ollie?
I think, two things. First of all, Germany has definitely got a lower level of regional economic inequality than the UK has by a long chalk. And as a result of the various things that Germany has done since reunification, the eastern states, which really were terrifically devastated economically at the end of communism, have gone a long way towards catching up. Now, the question is, how much did this mechanism that Andy Burnham has seized on actually contribute to that difference? And I think you can make the case that it was not the dominant factor. There were other fiscal mechanisms that probably contributed about twice as much alongside it. And then you've got the fact that the structure of the German economy is just a lot more distributed inherently than Britain's is. You know, there's a massive concentration of various sectors in London that's just not the same in Germany, where you have far more polycentric industries and services. And then one final point that I think makes it difficult to translate is these Bundesländer, the German states, have in many cases got really strong regional identities and deep histories of self-government. So there's an element of kind of political legitimacy for collectively saying you are going to have to chip in more money as a state to fund the others, or you are going to receive more money collectively as a state. Whereas if you go to parts of England that don't have a history of governing themselves collectively, for example, if you just point to like the southwest of England or East Anglia or something and say, congratulations, you guys are now kind of semi-autonomous, it's hard to know whether you can just transplant the sort of financial mechanisms of the German system without also transplanting something of the civic culture of regional identity that the Germans have.
Yeah, because the issue we have here is that at the moment, power would be devolved to regional mayors. Burnham's been enjoying that as Mayor of Manchester himself, and Steve Rotherham too as Mayor of Liverpool City Region. But the problem is our mayors are, to a certain extent, political appointments. So the Mayor of Greater Lincolnshire, Andrew Jenkins, is a Reform mayor, and Steve Rotherham is a Labour mayor. Who's going to decide what's important and what kind of powers are offered? And then are different politicians as mayors going to be taking up different threads of the new power that they have or the budget they have? What happens if Andrew Jenkins doesn't agree with Steve Rotherham or Andy Burnham as Prime Minister? So the kind of problem we've got here is, how do you get all these mayors to work together?
Yes, so in Germany, they do have a bunch of ways of working that through. And the most obvious of them is that instead of the House of Lords, the German upper chamber of parliament, the Bundesrat, is just a regional parliament. And collectively, they have the power to block laws, or they can rewrite legislation. They could even introduce it themselves so that it doesn't happen very often. And so that gives the state governments a very strong incentive to work together. And it also gives them a lot of kind of clandestine influence over what the federal government can and can't do, what is politically possible. And so you have a kind of consensus generating system that feeds all the way up to the top of government in Germany. And presumably it would take an awful lot of institutional reform to establish something similar in the UK.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's great to be able to analyse properly some of the ideas thrown around by Andy Burnham. The story's up online right now at thetimes.com and will be in tomorrow's paper as well. Oliver Moody is the Times and the Sunday Times Berlin correspondent. Oliver, really good to speak to you. Thank you.